Okay, so we are now recording, as you hopefully all heard. So welcome to our weekly call, the last call for January already, which is quite something. The month seems to have flown by this month. So in a second, sort of talk about the agenda. But firstly, I just got one thing I wanted to share for you. Just give me a second whilst I work out how to do that. Yep, this should work. Right, so tell me if you can hear this when it loads. Suddenly my machine's going very slowly, don't know why. Extremely slowly. I might abandon this experiment if it takes much longer. Problem with YouTube, I will abandon that. Let me see. There's one other option. No, maybe I'll do it at the end of the call rather than waste time now. Okay, let's move on from that. I'll hold you in suspense maybe, and we'll come back to it. So welcome to the call for the last call of January already. I'll put up, if I can share my slides. It should now work. Sorry, technical problems currently, apologies. Don't know why this is causing me a problem. Let me just have another go at that. Sorry about this. Normally this bit's straightforward. Yeah, okay, these are the right slides, so let's try. And do that again. Right, so try sharing. Right, hopefully that's worked this time and you can see the slides. So just as a reminder, as I said before we started the call proper, I'm going to talk a little bit about the OARC meeting next week. Then we'll touch on some recent developments, but we'll add to that the sort of latest views on the executive order on cybersecurity from the US, and then go through some other forthcoming events, etc. So that's the plan. So we're going to go straight into the OARC meeting, which, as I say, is next week. It's next Thursday and Friday. So any of you that are going to the NANOG meeting in Atlanta, it's the same venue, sort of the 2 days immediately afterwards. So NANOG is Monday through Wednesday of next week at the Marriott, and then the OARC meetings Thursday, Friday in the same venue. In terms of the agenda, I put day one on the screen. I'm not going to go through all of it in detail, but I just call out. You'll see I've highlighted over on the right hand side. There's a sort of section of 3 presentations on encrypted client hello and related topics. I'm doing one of those along with Ralph and Hong Ying Dong and colleagues, who's talking about DNS resource records in his case. So you have 3 different points of view on ECH related matters. And then at the end of the day, the other one to call out, which I mentioned briefly last week, is a discussion on best practices, which Phil is going to chair. He's the president of DNS OARC. and the intention is to start a discussion about where to find the relevant best practices for the sort of DNS ecosystem. I don't think there's any intent at the moment for OARC itself to produce best practice sort of documents, but to look to the various standards bodies and others. So, for example, the ITF, RIPE, ICANN, who knows, and sort of pull out those existing documents that seem to cover the right areas, or maybe identify some gaps that need to be addressed in the future. So that should be quite an interesting discussion. And then on the Friday, you'll see that there's a whole piece there around sort of DNS abuse, malicious content, etc., which I think is an entirely good thing to dig into. Then some stuff on DNS tunneling. And then the other one that caught my eye at the very end of the afternoon, I think this is one of 3 lightning talks. This particular one, a devil's advocacy for DOE, DNS over HTTPS, which I think I'm also intrigued to see. Not all of the slots have yet got the materials available. Most of them have. You can see that by where there's a paper clip to the side of the presentation, but you'll see there's a few there that have yet to have them uploaded, but most of them, certainly the majority at least, have got material there already, but a few still to be added before next week. But it should be a good couple of days. When I last checked, about 110 people were registered to attend, about 2/3 of those, so 80 or so, in person, and the rest remotely. So it'd be good. Should be a good 2 days following on from NANOG. So hopefully I'll see some of you there. And that was just a summary of the of that best practice panel, which we touched on also briefly last week. If anyone wants to take part in that hasn't already reached out to Phil, his email is on the bottom of the screen. As I said, you can join remotely if you're not going to be in Atlanta next week. So if you want to take part in that particular panel, just drop Phil a line and let him know. But it should be a good session. So that's probably it from me on that. So hopefully, as I say, I'll see some of you in Atlanta next week. So I'll dive into some of the news headlines and then I'll pause and perhaps we'll just sort of touch on that executive order or the cybersecurity parts of maybe that flurry of executive orders. So firstly, though, from the headlines, there was an interesting post. Dan Fiddler from APNIC sort of pulled out a piece from there's a recent report from, as you can see, IS3C that sort of itself covered those factors which would have a positive impact on decision makers when it came to deploying DNSSEC and RPKI. So given I think the sort of rate of adoption of DNSSEC has certainly slowed. I'm not sure if that's the case with RPKI or not, but I think both there's a lot of room to make further progress, if I put it that way. So I thought it was good to see that. And sort of linked to that, there's also an interesting piece which Paul Vixie flagged from Microsoft just on DNSSEC itself and associated technology, which he rated very positively. And if something in the DNS world sort of catches Paul's eye, I thought that was worth sharing as well. So that's the second bullet there. Moving on. Again, I'll skip over some of these, just pull out some others. So, there was a report. Again, this was APNIC actually. Pascal Huppert from SIDN Labs for his master's thesis had looked at the impact of DNS scanning And I thought it was really interesting that from his analysis, looking at the sort of .nl servers, about 30% of the traffic hitting those servers was DNS scanning traffic. Now, whether that's true of sort of DNS traffic more generally, I have no idea. But I thought that was quite interesting that he was highlighting that it was such a big slice of the overall traffic. Also, there's going to be a couple of sessions arranged, the first of which is also next week, I think. Circle ID are promoting this, 2 sessions on Whois and the move from Whois to RDAP. And they're just bringing people together for a sort of discussion on that space. So as I say, first of those is happening next Thursday. You do need to register to join the discussion, and the link is on the slide there. So I thought that was worth just flagging that. I hadn't noted that previously. There will be a second session. I don't know when that is yet, but as I say, the first one's on Thursday. And then finally, on the policy side, just the one at the bottom of the screen there, for those of you who have an interest in policy, this sort of Eurodig's entering the next stage of its planning for its meeting later on this year. They've sort of gathered a chance to sort of put forward issues. Which the deadline for that was the end of last year, literally, I think the 31st of December, and they've now had a chance to consolidate some of those. And there's the next stage of that is the planning meeting on the 5th, next Wednesday, I think that is. To start to sort of pull together something resembling an agenda for the meeting mid-year. So that's coming up quite soon. A whole load of other stuff going on, and so too much to cover on the call. But one thing that I will mention is the IGF Internet Governance Forum, which, again, those of you following policy will be aware, has been brought forward to the middle of this calendar year, not the end of the year, in Oslo, or Lillestrøm, just on the outskirts of Oslo. And the sort of proposed issues for that were published last week. So if you're interested on the policy side, maybe thinking about going to Oslo, then you'll see the list of proposed issues using that link. And then sort of final one, just to highlight again on sort of other interesting topics. One at the top of the screen there. There's a surveillance watchdog in the States, which is being dismantled. I think it's overstating it, but certainly the US sort of participants have been withdrawn. The reason I flagged that not as a political point, but was more because that's a key part of the EU treating the sort of US sort of data protection as equivalent to its European counterpart. And if that falls apart as a scheme, then it won't be legal to transfer sort of personal data from the EU to the US. So that's not the case yet, but that watchdog is a key part of that whole process. So be interested to see if it has any sort of knock-on effects over the next few weeks. But I'll pause there. So let me stop sharing my screen. Just pick up on the point that Vicky made before we started the call proper, which is if you cast your mind back to the last few days of the outgoing US administration, which published an executive order on cybersecurity, which covered a range of, a lot of sort of different topics, some of which we covered on this call, I think a couple of calls back. One of the topics being a requirement for federal agencies to adopt encrypted DNS. Firstly, to include a requirement for support of encrypted DNS in both clients and servers for new contracts, and then secondly for any existing systems that support encrypted DNS protocols to enable that support where that's technically possible to do so. And there were time frames on the agencies where they had to achieve certain milestones to do that. But the key one was for new contracts to put that in as a requirement for future purchases. Vicky, perhaps to the question that you posed before we started the call proper, if I understood it correctly, I think you were just suggesting or questioning whether some of the flurry of executive orders post the sort of new administration coming in, whether any of them sort of impacted on that executive order. Have I got that right? Or have I?
Yeah. I mean, I don't really need to know. I guess we can just wait and see what happens. But I was all excited when I read the latest executive order. I mean, there was a lot of regular best practices, sign your BGP, route updates, all kinds of stuff like that. But the encrypted DNS was kind of a surprise. But again, it was just in the last week of the waning administration. It seems like most of the Biden administration executive orders have been either rescinded or contravened somehow. And clearly, nothing will actually happen unless the agencies that are tasked with putting this into place prioritize it and do something.
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of wondering, because most of it seemed like just, generic best practices. I don't know why you would oppose it, but yeah, I just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, certainly when I read it, it seemed to not be a partisan topic particularly. Having said that, I think I read something within the last week suggesting that some of the new administration were looking at CISA and saying there'd been a lot of scope creep and it needed to narrow its mission considerably. So whether this sort of thing will be wrapped into that, I don't know. I don't think any of the stuff in the executive order was specific to CISA, for example. But I don't know if anyone has looked into that at all, or has been tracking any of the US executive orders and has an opinion on that, or whether it's just something to look out for over the coming weeks. So just pause in case anyone has any better knowledge that they can bring to bear or not. And if you do, just unmute and join in or pop something in the chat if that's simpler. Otherwise, we're marking.
Well, for instance, I literally just don't know whether or not the Federal Register has a habit of, when something they publish has been rescinded, updating that. It's not like the ITF. I don't know if they publish errata or anyway. Actually, now that it occurs to me, I know somebody who I can ask who will know. That might be the way to follow it, because, yeah, there's so many things being published. And sort of for my mental health, I'm trying not to read it all. So,
well,
yes.
think of it more as like a paper that's like announcing things. The stuff that goes into the CFR is the stuff that's actually official. The Federal Register is really more the required place for placing notice of pending regulations to make them available for comment. So no, they're not going to go back and clean stuff out.
okay.
Okay.
So how do you, is there a place you can look to see which of these is still active?
I think it actually does say in there now online. Let me take a look. I haven't spent much time looking at that since law school, so it's been a while.
maybe whilst Ross is sort of looking up, perhaps just move on, but certainly I'll make a mental note, Vicky, to also look out for anything over the coming weeks to see if there's anything published that clarifies the position. But Ross, if you pick up anything substantive that or can point.
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, let me just go back to my screen sharing then. Okay, just some deadlines coming up. A reminder that if you're planning to go to the next ITF meeting, either in person or to join remotely, that the cut-off for what was the early bird, now called the super early registration, is 23:59 UTC today. So you've got not that many hours, just under 8 hours to register before the registration cost increases. I think a couple of $100 roughly if you're attending in person. A bit less than that if you're joining remotely, although fee waivers are readily available for remote attendance. So do bear that in mind if you're planning to attend, that the rates increase as from tomorrow UTC time. Other stuff, there's a sort of few vacancies out there which may be interested to some people, but that's probably it on the most immediate deadline, as it's effective from midnight tonight UTC time. There's a large number of events coming up over the next 2 months. It just runs through to the end of March. I've added that beyond who is session that I mentioned that Circle ID are doing next week, but you'll see various other bits and pieces as well. I'd forgotten, if I'm honest, but see Cisco Live in Amsterdam's coming up early next month. We've got Morg in Lisbon, etc. So lots of different things. Literally, as I say, over the next 2 months, that's quite a long list of different activities which may be of interest to you. If anyone's got anything I've missed that should be added, as always, just drop me a line and I'll happily add those to the link. And I can see while we've been chatting, Vicky's added in the chat that it doesn't look like any of the cybersecurity executive orders have since been rescinded. So it does look like they're still valid, which is sort of helpful clarification. So finally, just a reminder, I'll have it confirmed later on today, but we should be covering the DNS for all project, not to be confused with DNS for EU. That's the plan for next week on Monday. And then if you're in Atlanta for NANOG and or for the OARC meeting, I'll be in the Marriott from Tuesday evening, so it'd be good to catch up in person with anyone that's attending either of those next week. So that's it from me. Obviously, as always, I'll thank our sponsors for the call, but let me just pause again, stop sharing. It's just a quick run through this week, and see if anyone wants to bring up anything else, or go back to anything that I've just sort of rapidly run through this week. So now's a chance to do so. And if you have, unmute or pop something in the chat, raise your virtual hand, whichever works best for you. I'll give a minute or two just to see if anyone does. Not seeing any typing at the moment. I can't see anyone having unmuted, so I'm assuming not. So in which case, a sort of shorter call this week, so only half an hour. So it looks like I'm going to give you half an hour back. So thank you everyone for joining the call. As I say, hopefully I'll see some of you in person in Atlanta for the meeting next week. So it'll be great to see you then, and also catch up on the call next Monday. So have a great week in the meantime. Thanks everyone.
Cheers all. Have a good week.
Bye.